Hello world, welcome back to Razor RC. Got a fun one today. We're going to be covering the build of my TLR 22X-4 four-wheel drive electric buggy from TLR. Just got released a few weeks ago. Good thing to work on while you're in sort of the shelter in place rules. But yeah, I just want to cover this build, talk about some pros, some nice things about the build, some cons, some issues I ran into, and then a bunch of tips. So things to make your build go a little more smoothly, and how to overcome a couple of little problems. I'm also going to cover the carpet setup, so what parts you actually need for the carpet setup. Out of the box is pretty much set up for dirt, and there are a bunch of parts that you will need to purchase in addition to if you want to run the kit carpet setup. So first off, just want to talk about the build overall. Instructions are really good. Really easy build overall. Actually, probably the easiest four-wheel drive buggy I've ever built. Just flowed through really nicely. I like how they do the instructions. They basically have you go from the inside out, building the discs, the shocks, and then like the turnbuckles first. And then once you kind of get those longer processes out of the way, you basically just build the whole chassis and just fit everything together, and it goes like super fast. So yeah, really nice build overall. I generally don't recommend a four-wheel drive buggy as your first kit to build, but if you are going to build one, or if you really want a four-wheel drive buggy and you've never built a kit before, this is probably actually a pretty good choice. Overall, a fairly easy build. Also, the highest quality TLR kit I've ever put together. Tons of carbon fiber sprinkled throughout. A lot of nice machined aluminum parts, like here on the stand-ups, uprights. The A, B, C, D blocks are all like nice black anodized, double machined, chamfered edged type components. Yeah, just high quality piece overall. They don't call this an elite kit, but you know, elite is kind of like their high-end version of their regular kits, and to me this is pretty much an elite kit. I mean, it's really nice, and I'm pretty amazed that they're able to sell this for under $500. So. Other pros, they got some nice little touches. The flanged nuts I really like up here on the back shock mounts, on sort of the camber link mounts, just provide a little more durability. They're not gonna sort of fall off on you or anything like that. So that's kind of an improvement they made through the years. They used to use kind of like these regular nuts, but these nice flange nuts lock everything in place. The whole kit is super light. They got the included fan mount, of course, back here. Most other kits, actually I think almost every other kit does not include a fan mount. 2 spur gears included in the box, so if you want to run mod, or you want to run like 13.5 spec, you got all the spur gears included. And then there's an extra hardware bag, so they give you some like nice extra pieces, some spares, diff shims, extra nuts, body clips, all that good stuff. So also extra instructions in the back of the manual, so they explain how to build the center diff, how to put in the diff shim risers, how to do the forward mounted slipper or center diff. So yeah, included all in the box, so you really don't have to hunt down extra instructions on different setups. It puts together really nicely. The only thing I don't like is the actually the center slipper. There's a little adjuster nut right there, but it's like a round piece. And normally these are supposed to be sort of hex or square or something, so that you can put a wrench on there, tighten it down to tighten down your slipper or loosen it or whatever. This is fairly difficult to work on. The only way I found actually to work on this, or to tighten the slipper, is basically back out that little set screw and leave your driver in there, and just use your driver as basically a wrench to turn that little round nut, because there's no other way to do it. The other weird thing is that little nut actually is only threaded on one side, so that set screw can only go on one side. The other side is just like a little peephole to figure out where the flat spot is on the actual shaft there. But yeah, kind of weird that it's only threaded on one side and you got that little set screw. Okay, so now on to some tips on putting together this kit. First off, the slipper kind of goes together in a weird way. It's not totally clear from the instructions how you actually put together the slipper, but the basic trick is to put the spur on there, put on the pads, put on both plates, and then finally put that center pin through, and then put on the last plate. They don't really explain that to you in the kit. They just kind of show you a diagram, but that's the order. It took me a little while to figure out. You also want to check the diff shimming On my particular kit, I'm running the 0.2 millimeter diff shim. It comes with 2.1s and 2.2 shims. I put on a single 0.2 shim. Somewhere between a 0.1 or 0.2 would be about right, but double check that diff shims because there are different sizes. The front and rear diff gears, I didn't have to do any shimming. They fit really, really nicely out of the box. That was perfect. Another tip is on the actual shocks themselves. There's a little bit of a groove on the bottom cap here. So there's a little white spacer. You want to make sure that groove is actually on the bottom. If you flip it over the wrong way, then it's actually going to leak a little bit. So there's a special orientation on that. Another thing that was kind of funny is that Savox servos do not fit in this kit. The 1258TG is a really popular servo, probably the most popular servo used at least here in the United States. I've got like 3 or 4 of them. The 1258TG and the 1257TG are going to be a little bit too far forward, and actually the servo horn is going to hit the body right here. So it's just spaced too far forward, so you're going to have to use a different servo. I'm running an Expert 4431, but yeah, definitely look into another brand because the Savox servos won't fit quite right. Another tip on the servo mount, you want to make sure that the servo is actually flush with that side bracket. You don't want those little ears sticking out a little too far, because what ends up happening is kind of makes the servo a little bit crooked, kind of at an angle, because it kind of pushes itself up against the center tunnel or center brace right there. So make sure that servo is nice and flush and you're not actually getting any bending. That's also actually the reason why there's no washer on that bottom servo mounting screw. I thought that was kind of weird, but that's the reason. It's just super close on the side there. Another tip, the hex drive pins and the CVA drive pins are actually almost identical, but one is just a hair longer than the other, and I think one is actually slightly thicker than the other. They look almost the same. Make sure you get the right pin into the right spot. The one that goes in the CVA is actually slightly shorter. If you use too long of a pin, then you won't be able to get that sleeve over that drive, or you won't be able to get into the bearing. Another tip is the CVAs kind of go together, kind of weird. It's also not clear from the instructions on how you actually put the CVAs into the diff, but the trick is basically put in the inside bearing first, then put on the bearing onto the CVA itself, put on the pin, and then finally slide it in, and it'll have to go in between that bearing that's already in there, and then finally you put on that final black pinion gear. Another funny thing is that the nut on that pinion gear is a 5mm nut. It's also a really thin and sort of small space to get a nut driver in there. So they actually include a T-wrench in the kit. So there's a T-wrench you can use. You don't have to buy a special 5mm nut driver, or machine your own to get one to fit. You can buy the MIP one, but they already include a T wrench in there that'll work. So just go ahead and use that. You want to make sure you tighten it down pretty good, because there's a little crush washer in there. You need to tighten it down pretty good so that the crush washer actually crushes the bit. That nut is held up really tight up against that input gear or that pinion gear, and so everything's really tight. So a little bit tricky because this drive shaft, you're sort of trying to hold on to that and turn it. I actually had a little pin drive removal tool that I used that I just kind of mounted on the end, and I could sort of torque it that way, but make sure that nut is tightened all the way down. Another tip, these bottom worm screws that mount on the shocks, the rear shocks here on the bottom, they're like a 20mm worm screw, and you want to thread it all the way in to about 10mm exposed, and that's what it'll look like when you got the final nut and everything on there. But they don't really tell you exactly how far to thread it in, and if you over tighten it, it kind of pops out the other side. It'll kind of stick out here on the arm. But yeah, measure it down to about 10mm, and that's just like the perfect length. The last suggestion I have is to use a little bit of black grease when you're screwing anything into these the diff housings. So these diff housings are made of pretty stiff, like high glass content, stiff azole type material. Put just like a tiny drop of black grease on every screw that kind of mounts into the diff case here itself, and it'll make your life a little bit easier, and you're less likely to wear out the heads on your actual screws. So yeah, that's pretty much my tips. I did have 2 problems I didn't mention yet. Number 1 is kind of a common problem. There's a bushing on the outdrives here that the outdrives actually mesh into, or kind of push into, and they're held in place by that plastic bushing. One of mine was just way too tight. I did actually have to ream it out with like a 5mm drill bit. I just took the drill bit and just pushed it in by hand and just kind of reamed it out a little bit by hand to get it freer. But the other thing you can do is kind of match the best outdrive. So try all 4 outdrives if you have this problem. Find which one is the thinnest and then use that one, and then ream if you need to with a 5mm bit as necessary. The other problem I had is that one of the rear outdrives, actually the axle was just machined a little bit wrong. The bearing would not actually fit over it. So this bearing right here, when I tried to slide on over the actual axle, it kind of got stuck on that last little groove. I think there was a little bit of a lip on there, so I couldn't quite get it on there. I just ended up filing it down a little bit and then just kind of forcing it on. So it is on there, and I can get it off with like a hammer or something, but get a little bit of a mistake. I haven't heard of anyone else having this issue, so hopefully I'm the only one. But yeah, if you run into that problem, you know, that's something you can look into. So next I'm going to cover the carpet parts you'll need to convert if you want to run the kit carpet setup. So out of the box is pretty much a dirt setup, and there are some extra pieces you want to look into. So kit carpet setup wise, up front, you obviously need stiffer springs. So kit setup is gold in the front and red in the rears. They also run thicker sway bars, so the kit setup calls for a 2.0 and a 2.0 in the rear. I'm actually just bought 1 pack of those, so I'm running a 1.8 in the front and 2.0 in the rear. But if you want to run pure kit setup, you have to buy 2 sets of sway bars, because each one only has 1 pack of 2.0s. Another part that you'll need to get is the front center brace here. So this is kind of a cross brace. The stock piece just kind of goes straight across here and separates these two. It has a little more stiffness. I'm not sure if it's critical or how important it is, but that is part of the kit setup. Another thing they don't recommend, or they don't actually tell you about, is that these little aluminum bushings here holding in the uprights, they only give you kit setup for dirt, so it's basically a medium and a medium. They actually make a thin and a thick one as well that you'll want to pick up if you want to be able to run lower spindle heights and stuff. So yeah, that's an extra piece that you'll need to pick up if you want to run the carpet kit setup. Always a good idea to get the aluminum servo horn, just adds a little more stiffness. I also am running the forward mounted center slipper or center diff position. So there's 2 positions, a back and a forward. If you want to run the forward position, which is part of the carpet setup, you'll have to get these extra drive shafts. So they make a shorter one up front and a longer one in the rear. That comes as a 2-pack, I think, for like $12 or something like that. So you'll need to get that for the carpet setup. Down the middle of the chassis, nothing else going on there. Rear again, you'll need to pick up the red springs, low frequency springs in the rear. And then finally the rear sway bar. And then you definitely want to make sure you put in that diff shim riser. That comes in the kit, so you don't need to buy that. Now another thing I recommend if you're running carpet is to pick up the 5.5mm rear hexes. So out of the box they're 5.0 hexes. So 5.0 hexes will fit TLR wheels just fine on the back. If you run associated wheels, they're actually going to be about a 1/4 millimeter more narrow. So that'll actually work. You can run those if you want. Just be aware, you know, overall track width will be about a 0.5 millimeter thinner. But then if you want to run Schumacher wheels, they're actually going to be a 0.5 millimeter thinner on each side. So that's why you got to get the 5.5 millimeter rear hexes. That'll push the Schumacher wheels out a little bit as well. And then if you're running associated wheels with that, well, instead of being a 1/4 millimeter too skinny, it's going to be a 1/4 millimeter wider, which should be fine overall. So yeah, those are my tips. Also the extra parts you want to get up for the carpet setup. Anyways, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, subscribe, hit the add notifications button. Look for more videos soon, and thanks for watching.